From joining the Mothers of Invention, releasing several albums as a duo, starring in and composing music for cartoons, hosting radio shows, and helping their friends find success by contributing their incredible backing vocals, Mark Volman and Howard Kaylan did many interesting things while unable to use the name The Turtles, and I'm here to tell you all about it, so watch this video all the way through the end to learn a bunch of crazy stuff. The Turtles had found incredible success, but increasing legal battles as well during their career in the 1960s. The label they were feuding with held the rights to the name The Turtles, and eventually the band decided to call it quits. The two silly frontmen of the group, Mark Volman and Howard Kaylan, didn't need to discuss between the two of them that they would go on working together. But for a period of time, they were out of work, not collecting sufficient royalties, and didn't know what they were going to do with themselves as they entered the 1970s. Howard received some offers, including the option to play for the new band that a guy named Donald Fagen was starting, Steely something, but he didn't want to start from the ground up, especially not without his favorite collaborator. Howard's second cousin, Herb Cohen, was Frank Zappa's manager, so Mark and Howard had been friends with and looked up to the incredible musician for many years. At one of his shows, he informed the lads that he was going to be putting together a new version of the Mothers of Invention, and he invited them to a family barbecue. They were asked to bring their saxophone so that they could show him their skills, which they didn't really have. But it was fine because Zappa was looking for lead and backing vocalists, and it didn't matter if they couldn't sax up to par with the top-notch professional musicians in the group. Zappa was always looking to push boundaries and try new things, so the mystery of what he had in mind was much more intriguing to the lads than a typical singer position that they could get. The other members of Zappa's band of virtuosos didn't understand why the pop singers were being added to their anti-commercial group and didn't initially respect them as equals. Frank was famously anti-drug, and he wasn't very happy when he caught Mark and Howard smoking herb inside and then again the next day outside of his studio, but when they were able to prove to Zappa that they were still able to remember every tiny intricacy of his extremely complicated compositions, Zappa laid off them. Later he would even partake a time or two, but a lot of people still don't know that. When they began playing on the road together, Zappa advised the guys to come up with some stage names. So they stole from Carlos and a guy who looked like an Eddie, and Howard became the Fluorescent Leech, while Mark became simply Eddie. The first album by this group, Chungas Revenge, was released in October of 1970, and the Fluorescent Leech and Eddie contribute to 6 of the 10 tracks. The album is packed with variety, with strict compositions, as well as more freeform ideas ranging from blues to avant-garde to prog rock to jazz fusion, while the comical lyrics are largely about sex and groupies. Zappa sings about what he knows, what can I say? Just a warning, I'm going to be talking about a lot of crude material in this video, so if you have an issue with that, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let this video play all the way through to the end so that way the algorithm knows it's a good video. Personally, the track that resonates most with me on this record is one of the instrumental songs that has a more of a jazz fusion, Hot Rats vibe, and the rest of the album shows me why some members of the Mothers, as well as old school Zappa fans, were skeptical going into this new era with Flo and Eddie. Though far from my favorite, this album has a lot of interesting tracks, and if you want to tap into the tracks with Flo and Eddie, I would say to listen to the short songs, Tell Me You Love Me, Would You Go All the Way, Rudy Wants to Buy You a Drink, and Charlena. I don't want to spend too much time going into the details of Zappa's crazy band, and some of this might be slightly out of order. But it was clear that creating the experimental film 200 Motels with its radical compositions was the major passion project for Zappa at this time in his life. He didn't expect, however, that shortly before filming, Jeff Simmons, his bassist, would walk away from the group. At first, Wilfred Bramble, Paul McCartney's grandpa on A Hard Day's Night, was brought in to fill the role. But after a week or so of rehearsals, he apparently freaked out and ran screaming down a hall never to be heard from again. While stressing out about who would replace the replacement in the film, Ringo Starr's chauffeur Martin Lickert walked into the room, and he just happened to be a bassist as well. For the actual official bass player in the band, on the other hand, they called in a familiar friend, Jim Pons from the Turtles, who also appears in the film. Frank's experimental movie, 200 Motels, came out in October of 1971. It pushed the limits for visuals at the time, features the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra playing the most absurd compositions they could have comprehended. Keith Moon is a hot nun. and Ringo Starr is a dwarf that dresses up like Frank Zappa. There isn't a strong plotline, and a lot of it is based on real life, and it feels like a way of looking into Frank Zappa's perspective of his friends and bandmates. Some of the dialogue is taken straight from reality, especially if Frank had overheard them saying anything nasty about his control over them. And I think this is a contributing factor to Jeff Simmons leaving the band. Of course, Frank then had to incorporate that into the film as well.
Don't listen, Jeff. Why are you wasting your life night after night playing this comedy music?
You're right. I'm too heavy to be in this group.
The film is mostly just a treat for super fans of the Mothers, but Flo and Eddie are super funny in it as well, and they are the first lines of the end credits for adding special material.
Hey, Frank. Hey, that's a great new song you wrote, the one about the penis and everything. I was laughing a lot the whole time I was learning. Yeah, we were all laughing, Frank.
On June 5th and 6th of 1971, the group recorded their shows at Filmore East to be compiled for a live album released a couple of months later in August, Filmore East, June 1971. Personally, I very much enjoy this record, and I feel like it demonstrates that live shows by both the Mothers and Flo and Eddie were probably way better than any of their studio releases. It feels somewhat like a concept album, with lyrical themes reappearing at times, especially once we get into the Flo and Eddie skit, Do You Like My New Car?, in which Mark is a groupie, not for the first time, and they take from a true story in which Howard had to sing Happy Together to a woman in order to progress things. Though not included on this album, these dates not only had a performance of Billy the Mountain, but John and Yoko were there as well. And though their show makes it appear as if it was truly spontaneous jam sessions, it was actually well rehearsed under Zappa's rule, something the former Beatle wasn't totally comfortable with. Mark and Howard famously bag Yoko while she's wailing on stage, and I'd always grown up with the impression that this was actually spontaneously done to silence her, but it seems it was something Yoko had orchestrated herself, and Mark and Howard referred to her directing them as a small eternity with Yoko Ono. Some of these collaborative jams were first released by John Lennon on his live album sometime in New York City in 1972, but the mix is way different, and they totally delete Flo and Eddie. They turn down much of what is going on stage, especially Don Preston's keyboards, and the album credits Lennon and Ono as the majority composers, even for Zappa's composition King Kong, which Lennon called Jam Rag and tried to claim all publication rights for. Zappa's mix would finally be released in 1992 and rename the final track to A Small Eternity with Yoko Ono. And in 2022, a new version of Live at Filmore East was released, with all of the desired bonus tracks from those two nights, and properly credits Howard Kaylan as a writer, as I believe he's the one who came up with the line scumbag. On December 4th, a couple of months after the film was released, they all came out to Montreux at the best place around, when some stupid with a flare gun burned the place to the ground. The Mothers were playing an encore at Montreux Jazz Fest when some stupid in the back shot up a flare gun as a sign of appreciation for their excellent show. Someone yelled fire, Howard said, "Arthur Brown, ladies and gentlemen," and Frank Zappa advised the audience to stay calm, but then he chucked his guitar and ran for it. The band escaped through the kitchen, and fortunately nobody died, but they all had to sit outside and watch the place burn down with all of their equipment inside. Deep Purple had also been at that show and immortalized the moment in their song. After that, Frank wanted to end the European tour early and go back home, but the rest of his band voted to keep going because they needed the pay, and they borrowed equipment from The Who and Led Zeppelin. However, less than a week later, on December 10th, at the end of another concert, someone jumped up on stage and pushed Frank Zappa into the orchestra pit. When his band looked down to see if he was okay, he was so twisted and mangled they instantly thought he was dead. The audience didn't allow the culprit to escape, and Herb Cohen beat him up. Frank was confined to a wheelchair for some time, leaving the rest of the band out of work and directionless. Interlude! I'm supposed to hit a gong, that's what my script says. Back when the lads first started touring with Frank Zappa, they met and befriended Mark Bolan of TRex, who they happily recorded free backing vocals for. We can't say for certain if Bang a Gong Get It On would have been as big of a hit if it weren't for the backing vocals on that chorus by Flo and Eddie, but we do know that they never got paid a dime for it. They appeared on TRex albums from 1970 to 1972, but when the struggling duo asked for payment to appear on a fourth album, Mark Bolan was too proud to pay them, but he was also reluctant to give up that sound, so he and his producer would attempt to mimic the sound of Flo and Eddie on future recordings. With similar voices, training backgrounds, and mindsets of just knowing what backing vocals would fit perfectly, Flo and Eddie became highly sought after throughout many decades for providing backing vocals. They appear on recordings by musicians such as Keith Moon, Roger McGuinn, Stephen Stills, Jefferson Airplane, Steely Dan, Duran Duran, Richie Furay, Bruce Springsteen, The Ramones, Blondie, Ray Manzarek, The Psychedelic Furs, their good pal Alice Cooper, and many more. I very much hope that you are enjoying this video so far, and if you are, please give it a like and continue watching all the way through to the end so that YouTube knows that this is quality content that they should recommend to others. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. Back to March of '72, a live album featuring recordings from the previous August would be released as Just Another Band from LA. Side B has 4 tracks, 2 of which have some turtley writing credits, including their buddy John Sider on Eddie Are You Kidding, which is a song spoofing a local salesman, and they also contributed the horrible tale improvised by Howard that Zappa thought was funny, Magdalena. The A-side of this record is a 24-minute edit of Billy the Mountain. It's a parody of rock opera that was usually over 30 minutes and probably played spontaneously differently at each concert. It tells the story of a beautiful mountain in California finally receiving a royalty check for all those postcards that he's posed in. So he takes his lovely wife Ethel, a tree on his shoulder, on a vacation across the states, stomping and destroying the countryside as they go. I'm a big fan of this song and think that Flo and Eddie's performance is just incredibly entertaining. Longer versions of this song can be found on later releases, the compilation with John and Yoko recordings, Playground Psychotics, and a quadruple live album at Carnegie Hall, recorded October 11th, 1971. Throughout the years, both before and after Frank Zappa's untimely death in 1993, more recordings featuring Flo and Eddie have popped up and been released on various live compilations due to Frank's tendency to rewrite his own songs and allow for improvisation on stage. So if you are a mega fan of these guys or just want to hear Jim Pons singing in German, fortunately there is a ton of content to consume. Prior to this early 1972 release, while Frank was still out of commission, most of his band transitioned into playing material written by Flo and Eddie that would have become the next Turtles album. Guitarist Gary Rolls from the band Love joined the new group that maintained keyboardist Don Preston, drummer Ainsley Dunbar, and our buddy Jim Pons, while Mark and Howard were able to regain the position of writer and producer for their own passion projects. But now they're in a new type of floundering position. They're no longer the hit-pumping band known as the Turtles, and they just got out of playing comedy rock with virtuosos backing them. Reprise Records had no idea how to market them, and it seems like Flo and Eddie mostly went under the radar. To further complicate things, when their self-produced album, The Fluorescent Leech and Eddie, was released in September of 1972, the album cover was flipped, placing Mark on the left, seemingly suggesting that he was the Fluorescent Leech and Howard was Eddie. So during this phase of their lives, they traded their regrettable nicknames. This is a fantastic rock album, utilizing Mark and Howard's skill for writing catchy and beautiful melodies without too much over-reliance on repetitive choruses. The overqualified band are constantly playing with progressive or jazzy mindsets, creating a sound that is rich with counter melodies and harmonies, and it really does it for me. The overly sexual comedy lyrics from Frank Zappa are gone, and we hear instead themes based more around disillusions, finding, losing, and longing for love. The introduction is comical, and I always laugh at one of the lines in Burn the House, a song about finding love, I believe. One of the many standouts is Lady Blue, a song Howard wrote about going to collect rent from his previous house and receiving a temporary payment from the female tenant instead. It is a haunting, slow waltz with long drawn-out syllables until the part about her perspective of him as a pop star, and the music changes to more resemble the Turtles before an epic climax. At this time, they took off on some joyous European tours, supporting Alice Cooper and his School's Out album, and Flo and Eddie were surprised to find that their label had supplied them with very vulgar merchandise to represent their brand. The label clearly didn't know how to market these guys coming off of their Zappa stint, but the tours were a success, so Alice Cooper's producer Bob Ezrin would take it upon himself to produce the next Flo and Eddie record so that they could tour that alongside Billion Dollar Babies. 1973's album, titled Flo and Eddie, is a little more typical sounding than what the two guys would have produced themselves, and they allowed Bob Ezrin to lean into heavy guitar lick driven anthem rock. Keyboardist Don Preston dropped out and was replaced by John Herron, but otherwise the band is the same as the previous album. There's a lot to digest here with a variety of styles and too much to talk about. One of the highlights is Afterglow. This emotional song about the feelings of a fresh breakup becomes a driving arena rocker with great dynamic rhythm changes in the verses before a wonderfully catchy chorus. There is also the song Carlos and the Bull, which is like a Spanish-inspired drama story with both spoken word and singing about a Spanish bullfighter. The album ends with Normandy Hill, an epic and progressive finale about Howard Kaylan's childhood, but a couple of tracks before that is a soft and beautiful song about life on the road as a struggling, less confident musician, which leads into a track called Another Pop Star's Life. It is hard to deny that this song was an attack on Mark Bolan, so when he heard it, he was pissed, and it seemed like their friendship would be over forever, but eventually they all did get along again, they got over their disputes, hugged it out, and Flo and Eddie even recorded on more TRex songs. Unfortunately, not enough people bought this album, so they were dropped from their label, their group disbanded, and some of them went back to working with Frank Zappa. After this, they got offered a weekly radio show, which they called Flo and Eddie by the Fireside. Many of their friends and other famous musicians enjoyed appearing on the show because it was way more fun than dealing with a typical DJ on a typical radio show. Instead, it was more of a eye-to-eye peers talking to each other and just having fun. When they played music on the show, they never played more than 30 seconds of a track, and they would allow tracks to flow into each other, kind of like a weird collage that never made any sense, but it was probably pretty fun. They eventually made their own company so that they could sell syndication of their show across the country, and they also did weird things like gather all of the feuding members of ELO without telling them that the others would be there. I believe this show only lasted a couple of years, and in 1989, they had another show that also lasted 2 years on K-Rock. By this time, they had recovered some of their rights to the Turtles and were able to buy out some of their old band members so that they could release a double compilation album and start gaining money for their old compositions again. The animated segment of Frank Zappa's film 200 Motels was produced by Charles Swenson of Murakami Wolf, later Murakami Wolf Swenson. Charles Swenson had then written an adult movie inspired by the success of Fritz the Cat, with the intention of Mark and Howard playing the lead roles. Down and Dirty Duck was released July 8th of 1974, and understandably didn't gather much of an audience, potentially due to the fact that it wasn't heavily marketed, but probably more so because it's totally insane. It is basically a sex-fueled adventure that includes the silly antics and some new tunes from our favorite Turtles.
What do you think you were dealing with? Look, I was in Miami. I know John. I know Yoko. Hey, you can't trust me. I know every album. Shut up, Yoko.
I was able to watch the movie on Internet Archive, and I wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but if you are a fan of crude animation or a huge fan of Flo and Eddie, then you should definitely give it a go. It definitely made me laugh quite a bit, and I ended up showing some of my friends some parts of it. They got a deal with Columbia Records and released a single that flopped, but later the Columbia executives actually saw a performance by the new lineup of the Flo and Eddie band and realized these guys do comedy. So they decided to capitalize on the humor aspect by releasing a partially live album in 1975. Some of the live tracks for Illegal, Immoral, and Fattening are reworked versions of songs from the Dirty Duck movie. Cheap was the original title for the film, and the song of the same title is a great concert and film opener as it makes fun of the audience for actually paying money to go and spend time with this nonsense. When Howard's horny character in the film goes to get himself a lady of the night, we hear the hilarious song Kama Sutra Time. Then the track Livin' in the Jungle seems like it's really racist, but I think it's actually meant to point out hypocrisy, and the first time I heard it, I laughed so hard that I had to remove my headphones to explain to the people in the room what was going on. The album also brings back some of the routine with Zappa, and the second half of the Kama Sutra Time song makes fun of some of their musician friends and other famous musicians. George Harrison's legal team tried to prevent the album from being released, and they had to be paid off, but others, like their friend Joni Mitchell, enjoyed the jokes at their expense. After this, the label thought it would be wise for the guys to re-record a version of the classic Turtles track, Eleanor, so that the public might start to understand that these were the same dudes. And this leads us to one of their best albums, Moving Targets, released in August of 1976. It begins with Mama Open Up, a song that is super honest about their current positions while referencing some of their moments from the past. Basically, they are saying that they hope that they've made their mothers proud, but they're also wanting to give up and just go move in with the parents again. During this last year, I was teaching some of my beginner musician friends how to operate as a band, and one day this song accidentally came on, so Thomas, the guitarist, who had more experience than the others in the group, started learning it by ear, and it became one of our favorite songs to cover. One of the song titles mentions that it is an unused theme for a television pilot. These guys had at least 2 opportunities to try to make their own TV show, and neither was picked up, so I couldn't find much information on it, and it doesn't matter anyway. Some of my favorite songs from this album include Keep It Warm, Guns, and Moving Targets. Unfortunately, right at the start of the tour for this album, there were 2 horrible incidents that took place within a day of each other and were likely related. The producer for Moving Targets, Skip Taylor, liked to have clean drugs available for his clients so that they weren't on the street dealing with sketchy people. But it seems that there was either some kind of misunderstanding or Skip tried to skip out on a bill, but someone broke into his house as a threat and warning, and they actually shot a bullet through a cover of Moving Targets, whether that was intentional or not. The following night, Flo and Eddie played a show in my home of Salt Lake City, where the 2 of them afterwards went ahead on to the next town with the Doobie Brothers, but their band stayed behind at the Hilton, where they hung out in guitarist Phil Reed's room on the 9th floor, discussing how much fun they were going to have on the tour. Eventually, everyone retired to their own rooms for the night, and in the morning, the paperboy found the lifeless body of Phil Reed outside on the concrete. When I googled articles about this, it seems like the Salt Lake City Police Department framed it as a suicide, but the others who were there say that there was clear signs that someone had tampered with his door, and there was an ashtray left keeping the door to his hotel room propped open. The band feared that they were under attack and flew back to California, but they were expected to continue their tour dates, and they recruited guitarist Billy Steele, and the Doobie Brothers used their private jet to help the guys get back on schedule. Spirits were clearly dampened, and in a way that was the end of the Flo and Eddie era. This video is probably long enough at this point, so I'm going to try to rush through the rest of things. They started producing records by other bands, including DMZ, Roadmaster, and the Good Rats album From Rats to Riches, which I enjoy quite a bit. And with a small budget, but still demand for Flo and Eddie to tour Europe, they came up with a new show in 1979, which they called the 2.5 Man Show. Andy Kahn, the keyboardist from their previous couple of albums, became the half a man, who would perform music for Flo and Eddie to sing over, as they would also show slideshows of their career and do wacky things, most notably their spoof of Pink Floyd's The Wall called The Fence. They signed to Rhino Records, and as the biggest group on the label at the time, they started releasing quite a bit of music, starting with some Turtles songs in 1978. From 1980 to 1986, they released a total of 8 EPs under the band name The Rhythm Butchers, using old recordings of the Turtles just screwing around basically, and in 1981, they released a compilation of old recordings from their surf roots as the Crossfires. In a 6-hour session in 1982, Mark, Howard, and keyboardist Andy Kahn created a spoof of electronic music called Checkpoint Charlie. They released it on a disc that plays from the inside out, and credited Mark and Howard as Salt and Pepper. Salt and Pfeiffer. Salt and Pepper. I don't know how German accent it. In 1981, the promoter from the legendary New York City venue My Father's Place paid for Flo and Eddie to go record a reggae album at Bob Marley's studio. This album, Rocksteady with Flo and Eddie, is probably a bigger waste of time than Checkpoint Charlie or anything else I've mentioned here. There is seriously only one song on the record that does not begin with a drum fill and then the most generic and boring reggae that you've ever heard. Basically every time it goes to the next track, I felt like the previous song was on repeat. If anything, listen to the version of Happy Together on this record, but otherwise, if you find a copy of this disc, just go ahead and throw it in the trash. No one's going to be offended or care. They did a lot more work with Murakami Wolf Swenson, including scoring The Adventures of American Rabbit, Peter and the Magic Egg, and the first Strawberry Shortcake TV specials. They also did 5 albums that introduced the world to the Care Bears outside of the greeting cards that they and Strawberry Shortcake were originally created for. There is a note in Mark Volman's book that says that when the Care Bears was released on DVD, Flo and Eddie's voices were replaced. But I couldn't find evidence that Flo and Eddie ever appeared on any animated Care Bears projects, only the audio records that predated them. If you can find actual evidence that they were on animated Care Bears, please share it with me, because I was going mad for more than 10 hours collected research trying to disprove this fact, or prove the fact. And my friend Ashley made fun of me by buying me a Care Bear. And unfortunately I'm not in Utah right now, so I do not have my copy of Moving Targets or my Care Bear behind me, which I had been intending. In October of 1977, they recorded a Happy Together sitcom TV pilot that wasn't picked up, and they had many talks throughout the years with David Bowie about doing a film with him, but that never came to be. Howard appeared in the 1983 film Get Crazy, but Mark walked away from the project, being replaced by John Densmore. In 1984, they began the first Happy Together tour, finally touring under the name The Turtles again, or I think sometimes The Turtles featuring Flo and Eddie. Joined by friends from other 60s bands, this became a near annual tour that is still happening to some degree today, though unfortunately due to health complications, Howard Kaylan has had to step away from touring. In 2003, Howard released a movie called My Dinner with Jimmy to celebrate his opportunity to puke all over Jimi Hendrix, and in 2006, he released a very enjoyable solo album called Dust Bunnies. If you haven't watched my previous video on the story of the Turtles, I highly recommend you do so, and to learn even more about the Turtles, be sure to purchase books by Howard Kaylan, Mark Volman, and Andy Kahn, as not only were these great resources for my video, they were very enjoyable as well. And now I am so exhausted from talking about and thinking about the Turtles for the past half year, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. Please be sure to give it a like, consider subscribing for more, fight me in the comments below, or just tell me your favorite things about the Turtles and some of your experiences with them. Also an option to send me a thank you present, and you can also thank me by watching my own original compositions. And until I make another video or whatever, have a happy listening session.